hears the cry and follows the trail. The last light of the July evening slanted over the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Range, pouring copper, and rose over the Montana wilderness. Everett Granger rode his bay gelding along an overgrown trail where the pine branches reached low, whispering in the strange, heavy stillness of dusk. It was the kind of silence that made every sound sharper, so when it came a short, choked cry, he knew it wasn't the wind. It was too human, too urgent, like a plea muffled by wood and earth. He reined in the gelding's ears, flicking forward, and sat perfectly still in the saddle. His mind flicked through what lay ahead on this trail. The old Dawson homestead sat a half-mile east, abandoned after fire gutted the main house last winter. Folks in town claimed wolves had moved in, but Everett knew how stories grew teeth when no one checked the facts. Still, the cry didn't sound like an animal, and the prickle running down his spine was not from superstition. He swung out of the saddle boots, crunching over dry pine needles, scanning the shadows. The barn half collapsed, leaned like a drunk against the field's edge. The fence lay broken in 3 places. The ground was littered with wind-blown leaves except for a patch near the charred front steps of the house. There the dirt was disturbed, the imprint of boots fresh and sharp. He crouched, brushing aside leaves, and frowned at what he saw. The prints were large, too large for a woman, too deep for a child. Something had happened here and recently. He followed them toward a broken crate shoved against the foundation. Beneath it, his hand found cold metal, an iron ring bolted to a square of wood. His pulse ticked up. With a steady pull, he heaved the hatch open, hinges groaning in protest, and a rush of damp, stale air hit him in the face. It carried the smells of rot sweat and something sour fear itself made tangible. And then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw her. The moment of rescuing Kiara. She was huddled in the farthest corner of the root cellar, knees drawn tight to her chest, tangled hair falling like a curtain over dirt-streaked skin. Her dress was torn at the sleeve. One bare foot streaked in grime, and in the dim light from the open hatch, her face looked pale enough to vanish except for her eyes. Blue, sharp, and defiant, they locked onto him as if weighing whether he was a savior or another threat. Everett didn't waste time with questions. "You're coming home now," he said, voice low, but certain as he reached a calloused hand toward her. For a heartbeat she didn't move, and he saw the war happening behind her eyes, fear battling the sheer will to trust. Then her hand lifted trembling fingers, light as bird bones in his grip. He pulled her upward, steady but careful, and when she broke the threshold into fading daylight, her knees buckled. She fell into his chest, the weight of her, nothing but the shocking heat of a living body too long kept in the dark. Without thinking, he caught her one arm across her back. "Name's Everett Granger," he murmured. "You're safe now." Her breath came ragged against his shirt. "Kiara," she whispered. "Kiara Talbot." The sound of saddle leather shifting reached them from somewhere beyond the ruin. Everett's head came up fast, scanning the tree-line, rifle slung and ready. The trail beyond was empty, but the tightening of his jaw said he didn't believe it would stay that way. Whoever had locked her in that hole might still be close. Returning to Everett's cabin, Kiara tried to straighten in his arms, her voice barely more than a scrape. "I can ride." She took one step and folded her legs, giving out like the ground itself had betrayed her. Everett didn't argue. In one motion, he lifted her, set her onto the gelding's saddle, and swung up behind her. She stiffened at first, every muscle in her back taut, but when his arm circled her waist to keep her steady, she went still, letting her head tip back against his shoulder. Her breath was shallow but alive. He nudged the gelding into a swift but careful pace, taking the narrow trails that led toward his cabin, tucked deep where the valley floor met the first rise of the hills. The ride stretched into a blur of shadow and pine. Everett's gaze flicking back every few moments, scanning for pursuit. No one followed, though his gut told him the trouble wasn't finished. By the time they reached his cabin, a 2-room structure with a stone chimney, small barn, and a well, her head lolled in exhaustion. He dismounted, caught her in his arms again, and carried her inside. Setting her on the cot by the stove, he poured water from the pitcher and held it to her lips. She drank slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. Then, voice raw, she told him Rufus Cain had locked her away for refusing to marry him. He had bought her father's land after his death, claiming she came with it. Everett's stomach turned. He'd heard Cain's name money fists and no morals, but hearing her say it made it fact, and now that made it his problem. The first days of recovery. That first night, Everett didn't even consider keeping the bed for himself. He banked the fire high, brought in extra wood, and told her to sleep. When she hesitated, glancing toward the cabin door as if she expected it to be barred, he said, "It's just you and me here." Then he stepped out into the cool dark and rolled his bedroll down in the barn, the gelding's steady breathing, a quiet anchor in the shadows. Before he closed his eyes, he checked every window latch, every door lock twice. By morning, a pale wash of light slipped through the pine boughs, and when he came in from hauling water, Kiara was sitting up in bed. Color had returned to her cheeks, not much, but enough to tell him she'd slept without waking to nightmares. She accepted the tin cup of coffee he set beside her, blowing across the surface. "You don't ask many questions," she said finally, voice still rough. Everett leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Only the ones that matter." She held his gaze for a moment, and something eased in her shoulders. It was the first time he saw her smile, small, almost accidental, but real. By midday, he was splitting wood outside, and she appeared in the doorway with a potato peeler and hand blanket draped around her shoulders. "Figured I could help," she said. They settled into a rhythm without talking about it. He cut wood, she prepped potatoes. He carried water, she folded laundry. In the quiet, her strength began returning in small increments. One afternoon he muttered something about his gelding being the most stubborn creature in Montana, and to his surprise, she laughed a short, startled sound as if she'd forgotten how. The first steps toward connection. It was near dusk when it happened. They stood on the porch watching the horizon bleed from gold to indigo, the crickets starting their nightly chorus. Kiara's blanket was wrapped tight around her, the last threads of sunlight catching in her hair. "You saved me," she said quietly. Everett shook his head. "I found you." She turned her face toward him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "That's not the same." "It is to me," he said, and realized as the words left his mouth that he meant them more than he thought. She studied him for a moment, and the wind pulled a strand of hair across her cheek. She didn't brush it away, and he found himself looking at her longer than he should have. "I feel safe here," she whispered. "You are," he replied, steady and sure. She reached out, then her fingertips brushing the back of his hand. It was light, almost uncertain, but not an accident. Neither of them moved away. The silence between them felt like a choice rather than an absence. The air smelled of pine and cooling earth, and for the first time since he'd found her, Everett thought maybe this place, this life could hold more than survival, bringing Cain to justice. The next morning, Everett saddled the gelding and told Kiara he'd be back before noon. He left her with his shotgun leaning against the wall and a quiet promise. "You'll be fine." In town, the sheriff's office smelled of coffee gone cold and oiled leather. Sheriff Reynolds listened as Everett laid it all out. What Cain had done, what Everett had seen, and the woman now in his care. Reynolds' face went grim. "You willing to testify?" Everett didn't hesitate. "Yes. She will too when she's ready." The sheriff's jaw worked as he considered. "Cain will run when he hears." Everett met his eyes. "Not if you ride now. Take him before he knows she's free." By sundown, Rufus Cain was in irons, his swagger replaced by a glare that Everett met without flinching. When Everett returned to the cabin, Kiara was at the door, her shawl clutched tight. "You told them," she said. "I had to." For a heartbeat, she searched his face. Then, "And if he comes back," Everett's voice was low but certain. "He won't." The fire in her eyes matched the first day he had seen her, but now it burned steadier. "I don't want to leave here," she said. He took her hands in his, feeling the thin strength in her fingers. "Then stay." She didn't answer in words, just stepped forward until her forehead rested against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, as if he'd always known she would. A letter from the past. The rain came soft and steady 2 mornings later, drumming a silver rhythm across the cabin roof. Everett was mending the front gate, a coil of wire looped over one arm, when he heard the door creak open behind him. He didn't turn right away. By now he knew the sound of her steps, light but sure on the porch boards. "You didn't say you had a brother." Kiara said, her voice carrying just enough curiosity to make him glance over his shoulder. "I don't," he replied, twisting the wire tighter. "Why?" She held up an envelope, edges damp from the mist. "This came in the post. Says it's from a man named Lee Granger." Everett stood slowly, brushing rain off his hat brim. "My father's cousin's boy. We shared a roof a few years after my ma died. He left for mining work back in '78. Her eyes followed his hands as he tore the envelope open, reading in silence. Then he folded the letter with the same care he'd use on a map before a long ride. "He wants to know if I'd sell him a strip of land along the creek," Everett said. "Says he's planning to bring his family west." Kiara tilted her head. "Will you?" Everett's jaw flexed. "No, there's too much blood in that soil already." She didn't press him, sensing there were things in his past he'd only speak of when ready. Instead, she reached for a second basket of beans by the door. "We could take these to the widow Nance tomorrow. Her gardens had a poor season." Everett eyed her with a faint smile under the brim of his hat. "Thinking of staying long enough to be neighborly now. I'm thinking of staying long enough to plant something," she said, not looking at him, "and see it grow. Stories over rain and fire." The cabin smelled of beans and salt pork by evening. Kiara worked at the stove, sleeves rolled, hair damp from the mist. Everett leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching her stir the pot with slow, even circles. "You cook the way someone taught you," he said, gentle but not careful. Her mouth quirked, but her eyes stayed on the spoon. "My mother taught me." All her recipes started with lard and ended in silence. Everett's gaze softened. What was her name? Ruth. The name seemed to linger in the air between them. She went on, voice low. "She used to say a woman could carry sorrow 2 ways tied up in her apron or buried in her back. I think she carried hers in both. Everett stepped closer, not to comfort, but to listen better. When I was small, Kiara continued she'd sit by the window during storms, sewing until her fingers bled. Said thunder cleared old hurt from the air. "You still believe that?" he asked. She turned her eyes, tracing something in his face. "Tonight I might." They ate in quiet, the rain tapping against the windows, 2 spoons scraping opposite sides of the pot. Afterward, she lit the oil lamp, the flame casting her in a gold haze. "You never said what made you ride down that trail," she said. "Was hauling salt blocks to the cattle." He replied, "Heard something I couldn't explain. Most men would have kept going. I'm not most men." She smiled faintly, but the shadow in her gaze didn't lift. "I keep seeing the hatch." Counting the knots in the wood until I fell asleep, there were 37. Everett's voice was steady. "You don't have to sleep there anymore." "I know," she said, looking toward the door, "but I still wake up facing the corner." He didn't offer hollow comfort. He simply reached across the table and set his hand over hers, warm and rough. "You're not where you were," he told her. She looked down at their hands. "Feels like I've forgotten how to be anything besides afraid." "Then remember something else," he said quietly. "Start with what's right in front of you. A moment of quiet closeness." That night, when the fire had burned low and Everett had unrolled his bedroll by the hearth, Kiara stood by the cot, unmoving. "You don't have to sleep on the floor," she said softly. He looked up at her, the lamplight catching the line of her jaw, making her look both older and younger at once. "I'm not sure you're ready for that," he answered honestly. She shook her head. "I know I'm not. But I'd like to sit beside you for a while. I don't want to be alone with the quiet tonight." He nodded once, no hesitation, and crossed the room. She sat on the edge of the cot, and he took the stool beside her. They didn't speak. The silence wasn't empty. It held the weight of everything they hadn't said and the fragile beginnings of trust. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Inside, the fire's last embers glowed faint red. After a while, her shoulder touched his light as a drifting leaf. He didn't move, and neither did she. It was a stillness they shared, deliberate and unbroken, like the first green shoots under a frost-hardened field. For the first time since he had pulled her from that underground darkness, she closed her eyes without fear. A warning from Amos Trigg. The sky had shifted into that muted gray that comes before autumn rain, the air heavy with the smell of pine pitch. Everett had gone east early that morning to help old Mr. Havs mend a broken axle, leaving Kiara with the cow to milk eggs, to collect, and the quiet rhythm she had come to trust. She tied her hair back with a strip of calico he'd cut from an old shirt, stacked kindling by the stove, and felt almost settled until the knock came. It wasn't the hesitant tap of a neighbor, nor the polite rap of someone unsure. This was 2 firm, confident knocks, each one certain of itself. Her breath stalled for the briefest second. She was back in that cellar in her mind, hearing the groan of the hatch above her. But she stood straight, crossing the room with deliberate steps. The man on the porch looked trail-worn, but composed, boot-scuffed shirt crisp in a way that suggested he'd dressed for more than travel. His hat shadowed his face until he tipped it back. "You Everett's woman?" he asked without preamble. Her spine straightened. "Who's asking names, Amos Trigg? Down Deer Creek way." His gaze was steady, his manner careful. Heard something about a woman found out near the Dawson place. Thought maybe you'd know the truth of it. Kiara kept her hand on the door frame. What truth are you hoping to find? He scratched at his jaw eyes, flicking past her shoulder to the shadowed cabin interior. Kane's kin's been asking questions. Not in town, quiet-like. They don't know where you went, but they're looking. A woman who disappears from one place and shows up in another ain't safe until they stop. I didn't disappear, Kiara said, her voice even. I survived. His eyes narrowed slightly as if measuring the steel in her tone. They won't see it that way. I came so Everett would know, but since he ain't here, I figure you've got a mind of your own. She nodded once. Thank you. Amos tipped his hat and stepped off the porch without asking more. She shut the door, dropped the latch into place, and stood still for a moment, listening to the rain begin in the distance. Then she moved through the cabin with purposeful calm, checking each shutter, counting matches, shifting her boots close to the hearth in case she needed to run. She didn't feel the sharp panic of before, just a focused readiness, the resolve to stay. By the time Everett returned, leading the mule cart, heavy with split timber, Kiara was waiting at the edge of the porch, her shawl wrapped tight against the wind. You expecting trouble? He asked, unloading the first bundle. A man came. Said Kane's people are sniffing around. Not the law, just family. Everett paused, setting the wood down slow. Did he threaten you? No. He warned me. Said I've got a mind of my own. Everett gave a small nod, his eyes scanning the tree line before looking toward the barn. I'll sleep lighter tonight. Kiara stepped down from the porch and took the rope from his hands, tying it off to the post as he would. You ever think about what comes next? She asked. I think about it every morning, he said. She took a breath, the wind catching the loose strands of her hair. I want to stay, not just for a season. I want to build something that can't be taken. His eyes held hers for a long beat, the answer forming not in haste, but in the certainty that matched her own. You already have. That night they sat on the floor by the hearth, sorting dried beans into shallow pans. The sound of them tumbling was soft and steady like a second heartbeat under the fire's low crackle. They worked without looking at each other, but the quiet between them was the kind that bound rather than separated. At one point, Kiara paused with a white bean between her fingers. When I was small, I thought marriage was something decided by a man's will, like livestock or land. I never saw it done with care. Everett set his pan down. If I ever asked, it would be with your eyes open and your hands free. Love and commitment. She looked at him then, and her voice didn't waver. Then ask. Everett didn't rush. He wanted the moment to hold its weight. Stay with me, Kiara. Not because you have to, because you want to. The answer came without hesitation. I do. I want to build this life with you from the ground up. Something unknotted in his chest as he leaned forward, kissing her slow and sure like a man sealing a promise he'd been holding back until it was safe to give. Her hands found the collar of his shirt, her breath warm against his cheek. Nothing rushed, nothing uncertain, just two people meeting at the same point from very different roads. Morning brought a soft gold light spilling across the valley. They stood together by the fence line, the old fear still somewhere deep inside her, but it no longer ruled. When it tried to reach for her hand, she laced her fingers with his without hesitation, They had no preacher, no written vows, just two souls who had survived what should have broken them and now chose deliberately to bind their lives together. It was enough. It was everything. Kiara decides to teach the air had turned sharp enough in the mornings that Everett's breath came out in pale clouds when he went to split wood. The first frost clung silver to the porch railings and traced the tops of the fence posts. One morning, as he stacked the last of the logs, Kiara stepped outside with her shawl pulled tight, looking toward the ridge where the pines were already holding snow on their highest branches. "It's going to be a hard winter," she said. Everett set the axe aside and followed her gaze. "I'll trap more this season. Trade for what we can't grow." She hesitated, then eyes shifting back toward him. "I've been thinking about the old schoolhouse near Alder Creek. It's rough, but the roof's still good." He straightened, the surprise not in his eyes, but in how long it took him to answer. "You thinking of teaching?" She nodded. "There are children out that way. No one's looked after their learning since the preacher's wife left for Illinois. If I don't do it, I'm not sure who will." Everett studied her, how her hands didn't twist in her shawl when she spoke, how her chin lifted slightly like she'd already decided. "You'd have to ride out alone some mornings." She met his eyes evenly. "I know the trail, and I can shoot straight thanks to you." That earned the faintest pull of a smile from him. "Then I'll fix the stirrups on the mare. She'll be better for cold mornings than the gelding." They didn't speak of the risks. They didn't need to. The choice was already made in her heart. A few days later, they rode out together to see the place. The windows were dusty but unbroken, the front door swinging wide on stubborn hinges. Inside the desks still stood some missing legs, others listing to one side. A small stove sagged in the corner, rust creeping along its base. Kiara walked in, first her boots echoing against the plank floor. "It just needs hands on it," she said, a kind of quiet pride already in her voice. "Restoring the schoolhouse." They returned the next morning with a sack of nails, a hammer and a tin of oil for the hinges. All week, Kiara worked from sunrise to near dark, scrubbing soot from the stovepipe until her fingers ached, sanding splinters from the desks, scrubbing the black slate until it shone again. Everett helped when he could, but often he left her to the work. He understood what it meant to claim something with your own hands, to shape a place so it belonged to you. By Saturday evening, she returned to the cabin with soot streaking her cheeks and a blister blooming at the base of her thumb. She tried to hide it, but when she sat on the bench by the stove, stretching her fingers, Everett noticed. He poured water into the basin, unwrapped a scrap of cloth, and dabbed the blister gently with the cool water. "You should have said something," he murmured. She shook her head. "I didn't notice until I stopped." His touch was careful but without hesitation. "You're stubborn," he said. Her lips curved faintly. "You didn't take me in hoping for someone delicate." Everett's gaze didn't waver. "No, I took you in not knowing what you'd become." She tilted her head toward him, and now his voice dropped a notch. "Now I think I knew even then." Reclaiming her identity, she leaned into him, then her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as if to anchor herself. "If I'd never been locked away," she said quietly, "I wouldn't have found this place." Her eyes lifted to his. "Found you?" Everett's jaw tightened, not from anger, but from the ache of knowing the truth in her words. "You shouldn't have had to be broken first," he said. "I wasn't broken," she answered without pause. "Just buried. You helped dig me out." They stood there for a long moment, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people who had chosen each other again and again in the small, deliberate acts that made a life. That night, Kiara pulled her own blanket from the chest and spread it across the cot beside Everett's. She didn't speak, and neither did he. But when he lay down, he reached under the covers until his hand found hers. She let their fingers rest palm to palm. No grand gestures, no need for them, only the steady, quiet certainty that they were building something worth keeping. By the time the schoolhouse opened a few weeks later, her blister had healed, her voice carried confidence when she called the children's names, and her eyes, once darting and uncertain, met the world head-on. Opening the schoolhouse. By mid-November, the air bit at exposed skin, and the morning frost clung stubbornly to the earth well past sunrise. On the schoolhouse's first day, Kiara rose before Everett. Her hair tied back neatly, a small satchel packed with chalk slates and a tin of molasses cookies she'd baked the night before. Everett rode with her as far as the ridge, the mare's breath clouding in the cold. "I'll see you this afternoon," he said, and she nodded, adjusting the scarf he'd given her weeks earlier. 3 children came that morning, their cheeks pink from the cold, their boots tracking snow melt across the plank floor. By the end of the week, 2 more had joined, brought by a mother who'd heard of Kiara's lessons through the postmen. She taught them in a voice that carried just enough authority to hold their focus, and just enough warmth to make them lean forward in their seats. Between sums and spelling, she caught herself smiling, not the tentative curve she'd worn in the early days here, but something fuller, steadier. On Fridays, Everett would stop by on his way back from mending fences or trading in town. He'd stand in the doorway until she noticed, then step inside to leave her whatever she might need for the week ahead. A jar of preserves, a sack of kindling, sometimes just his quiet company, while she swept the floor. The work left her tired in a way that felt earned, and when she returned home in the evenings, her hands smelled faintly of chalk. Her eyes lit with the small triumphs of the day. A gift for the winter. One evening, as snow began falling in thick flakes over the pasture, Everett came in from checking the stock to find a new scarf hanging by the door, a deep, earthy brown that matched the mare's coat. "Traded with the widow Nance for the wool," Kiara said from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. "Figured your neck could use the extra warmth." He took the scarf in his hands, turning it over once before meeting her eyes. "You made this," she shrugged. "It's plain work." "It's good work," he said, stepping closer. He looped the scarf around his neck, his fingers brushing hers as she helped knot it snug. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have," she said softly. He didn't look away. "You gave yourself," he replied. For a moment, they stood like that, the cabin warm around them, the snow thickening outside, until she reached up and cupped his jaw. "This is home now," she said. He leaned down, kissing her without urgency, the kind of kiss built to last through years, not moments. In the glow of the firelight, with the cold pressing at the windows, it felt like the whole world had narrowed to the space between them, the deepening of home. By mid-December, the valley lay under a thick hush of snow. The schoolhouse was shuttered for the season, the children kept home by ice-bound trails. Kiara turned her attention inward to the home they were shaping with patient, deliberate hands. She mended by the hearth in the afternoons, the new ticking mattress she'd sewn, now spread across the cot they shared. Everett had built a wooden chest for her things, carving wildflowers into the lid from the sketches she'd described from her mother's garden. On the shelf above the stove, her books sat alongside a tin of tea he steeped for her each morning without needing to ask. One evening, he returned from checking the trap lines with a parcel wrapped in calico. "Traded with the McLennan brothers," he said. Inside was a length of russet wool soft under her fingers. She looked up at him, her throat tightening. "You remembered my mother had something like this?" His answer was simple. "I remember everything you tell me." She folded the wool carefully into the chest, then walked to him as he unlaced his boots. "You never say much about before you came here," she said. His hands paused. "My mother died when I was 13. My father drank what we had after that. I left Missouri with what I could carry and didn't look back. Wasn't anything worth remembering." She sat beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. "You've built something worth remembering here," she told him. He looked at her, then his eyes holding something unguarded. "Didn't know how much I needed someone to see it." She reached for his hand, pressing it to her chest. "You gave me back my name, not just the sound, but the meaning." And in the warm, lamplit quiet, the truth of it settled between them unshaken by the cold, pressing against the cabin walls. Winter rituals. By January, the world had narrowed to a circle of warmth around the stove and a horizon of white beyond the windows. The creek wore a glass lid, and the pines wore coats that never quite dried the snow, crystallizing along each needle until the branches bent with the weight. Everett learned the rhythm of winter the way a man learns a hymn, same notes, new meaning each time. He rose in the blue hour to stoke the fire, split kindling with a careful economy of motion, then shoveled a path from the porch to the barn while the sky pinked at the edges. Kiara met the morning by warming yesterday's coffee on the stove and cracking the kitchen window, 2 fingers' width to let the bite of air sharpen her senses. She liked the way the cold made the steam visible as if the cabin itself were breathing. They took turns reading in the afternoons. Everett carved spoons from cedar scrap, letting his hands memorize the curve of usefulness, while Kiara sewed curtains from flour sacks and stitched small wildflowers along the hem in tiny, stubborn color. On Sundays, they read aloud from the battered book of verse she carried west from Kentucky. He stumbled over certain words archaic, laced with a music he hadn't known you could speak, and she taught him the means behind the music, the way a line could turn on itself and land in your chest like a truth you'd always had, but never named. When he grinned at a phrase that pleased him, she felt the grin in her own ribs. Sometimes a wind would come down off the mountains and rattle the roof like a player testing a drum. Those nights the past prowled the edges of Kiara's mind. She still woke facing the corner now and then, breathing 2 fast hands, searching for boards that weren't there. Everett didn't name it or try to talk it into submission. He only shifted closer, the heat of him against her back, and laid a steady palm along her forearm until her breath remembered itself. "You're here," he would say, never more than that, and the 2 words stretched a bridge across the dark. It wasn't all softness. Traps had to be checked, fence posts repaired where frost heave had lifted them wrong. On one bitter morning they worked the line together, their breath marching ahead of them in white flags. The wire snapped back and bit Everett's knuckle, bright blood beading in the cold. Kiara took his hand, without comment, wrapped it in a strip torn from her hem, and held it until the sting faded. The bandage wasn't necessary. The gesture was. He looked at her then with a gravity that made the moment feel larger than the acreage around them. "You keep me?" he said simply. She answered by tying the knot a shade tighter as if to prove it. Every evening had a small ritual one to close the ledger of the day. Some nights it was the last cup of tea shared hand to hand. Some nights it was the quiet inventory of wood lamp oil and flour spoken like prayers. And some nights it was just the lamp turned low, and their two shadows moving as one against the wall, proof that the winter outside couldn't empty what they were filling within. The letter and the vow. Early March brought the kind of thaw that tricks a man into believing in spring before the ground agrees. Water began to speak again under the ice, a furtive murmur at the creek's edge. The barn smelled less of cold iron and more of animal. Everett stood by the stove one morning, a sheet of paper in his hands, folded and refolded until it carried its own memory of his fingers. "I've been working at this," he said, offering it to her with the deliberate care of a man setting down a tool he respects. Didn't want to say it wrong. Kiara wiped her palms on her apron before taking it as if the paper might bruise. She read lips shaping the words in silence. It wasn't poetry, and it wasn't a speech. It was the straight road of Everett's mind put down in black, how he'd been a man who lived by tending what could be tended and leaving the rest. How the day he heard a sound that didn't belong to the woods, it set his life to a new heading. How he didn't save her so much as meet her where the world had failed, and how since then every task had felt steadier with her there to witness it. He wrote about the way her name turned the cabin from shelter into home, and about wanting the future to be a thing they made on purpose. The last line was a craftsman's line, no flourish, just truth. "If you'll take me, I'm yours in every weather." She looked up with eyes that were bright but not breakable. "You really want this?" He didn't step closer because the question wasn't about distance, it was about clarity. "More than I've wanted anything," he said. "And only if you want it too." Her nod arrived before the words. "I do. I want it with you." They married a week later in the small clearing behind the cabin where the ground finally softening let the earliest shoots suggest green under the brown. Widow Nance and her grown son came as witnesses, bringing a loaf of bread still warm in a towel. Everett shaved close and polished his boots until the creases looked like intention. Kiara wore the dress she'd mended with the russet wool he'd traded for, and a narrow border of stitched wild flowers along the hem, a small garden she could carry. She held a handful of pine and last year's dried lavender bound with twine. No preacher, no rings they couldn't afford. Just words spoken plain enough to weather "I see you. I choose you. I'll keep choosing when the wind goes crosswise and when the days are long and easy." They broke bread, sweetened coffee with molasses, and stood by the fence with foreheads rested together in the ordinary holiness of a choice made once and made daily thereafter. That night when the wind ducked and the stars came clean, Everett wrote the date with a carpenter's pencil on the inside of the cedar chest he'd built for her, a quiet ledger entry under the lid. Kiara saw it later and smiled, tracing the numbers with a fingertip. A vow has to live somewhere. Theirs lived in wood and work and in the privacy of their bodies, sleeping one life across two breaths. Spring work, deeper roots. Spring doesn't arrive in the valley so much as assemble itself from small certainties, brown turning to a dozen greens, the creek shouldering off its last armor, birds returning like patience rewarded. Everett and Kiara met the season, with a plan drawn at the table between them, a map made of tasks instead of roads. They would add a second garden plot, where the sunlight lingered even after the ridge swallowed it elsewhere. They would dig a new root cellar, deeper, wider dry as truth, so autumn's plenty could ride out winter without fear. They would run new wire along the south fence where elk liked to test a man's resolve. The cellar was Kiara's idea, and she stood beside Everett the first morning with her palm flat on the shovel handle, not as a symbol, but as a worker. The first foot of soil lifted easy, the second, less so, old stones surfacing like memories you don't want but must set aside. She didn't flinch when they hit a seam of clay. "We'll line it with rock," she said, and Everett saw in her face a geometry of will angles that wouldn't cut, but would hold. When they rested, sitting on the lip of what would keep them come winter, Kiara laid her hand over the earth and said, "I won't be kept under again." He answered by setting the next stone square and sure. The second plot took shape under their knees. They worked rows in silence, punctuated by small talk that meant everything, how the clouds told time which pea variety held sweetest where the soil asked for ash, and where it wanted bone meal. In the evenings they walked the fence line with a pail of staples and a post mall pressing the place's perimeter back into integrity. A rancher from up toward West Fork stopped by to trade salt for help with a lame colt. A mother from Alder Creek brought eggs and news that 3 more children would start lessons after planting. The world crept closer, not as threat, but as community, each visit a stitch tightening a quilt neither of them had owned before. Their language shifted subtly, the grammar of survival, giving way to the syntax of belonging. Your garden became ours. My chores turned to let's get it done. She began to measure time not by fear, but by harvest peas in June, beans in August, apples hauled in borrowed crates from a neighbor's orchard, pressed into sauce on a fire that smelled like memory instead of warning. On a late evening thick with gnats, Everett tied a string line for straight furrows and looked over to find Kiara watching him, soft amusement in her eyes. What, he asked. "You make even dirt behave," she said. He grinned. Only the dirt that wants to. Sometimes grief still knocked in the night, a hatch creaking in her mind, a ghost hand on her throat. When it did, she sat up and counted the slats of moonlight on the floor instead of knots in a board above her. 37 had been the number of fear. Now the numbers were different every time, and that was its own prayer. Everett would wake and sit with her, not to fix it, but to keep vigil. "You're not where you were," he'd say the phrase already, a nail driven true into the frame of their life. By midsummer, the cellar walls were stacked tight, the roof framed and tarred, the door hung on hinges that wouldn't groan. Kiara stood at the threshold, breathed the cool earth smell, and smiled with a calm that had weight. This space dug by their hands answered a past that had tried to define her. She closed the door gently, not to shut something in, but to keep what mattered safe. Then they walked back to the house together, the evening laying gold along the fence rails, their shadows long and parallel the measure of roots taking hold. Years of quiet permanence. The years didn't so much pass in the valley as accumulate layer on layer like silt at the bend of a slow river, until what had once been bare ground became rich with what they had planted. The cabin doubled its size with a second room Everett framed in a summer when the heat sat thick in the air, and Kiara brought him water with sprigs of mint floating in the tin cup. A wide porch ran along the front, now 2 chairs set side by side in the same place every evening so they could watch the light pour itself across the field. They still kept the old routine. She rose first to stir the fire and put the kettle on. He followed to check the animals and mend whatever the night had taken a mind to undo. The garden grew in ambitions each year, rows of beans, peas, potato squash, and the small patch of wildflowers Kiara planted at the far edge, not for harvest, but for the sight of them. Everett teased her about giving space to something that didn't fill the larder, but she knew he liked them too. More than once, she'd found a few blossoms tucked into the windowsill after he came in from the fields. The schoolhouse was never empty for long. Children aged into their parents' work, and new ones took their place, bringing with them the same curiosity, the same stubbornness about arithmetic. By then, Everett's name carried quiet weight from Alder Creek to West Fork. Folks came to him when a fence line was disputed, when a neighbor's stock had wandered, when something needed fixing in a way that would last. Kiara's reputation was just as steady. Her lessons sent children into the world, able to read contracts, write their own names, and count what was owed without being cheated. They didn't seek recognition, but it came anyway, folded into the fabric of the valley, until their presence was simply part of what it meant to live there. At night, when the work was done, they would sit on the porch in silence, the air carrying the smell of pine resin and turned earth. Sometimes they spoke of the past, not to reopen wounds, but to mark how far they'd come. "We've built something," Everett would say, and Kiara would answer, "We're still building." It was true. The life they had wasn't static. It grew, changed, adapted, but its foundation stayed the same 2 people who had chosen each other, not once, but daily in the long shadow of years, remembering the beginning. One autumn morning, after the first frost had dusted the pasture, Silver and Gone Everett sat with Kiara on the porch, their hands linked without thought. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, and the light that touched their faces was thin and cool. "You remember the day I found you?" he asked, voice low, almost lost under the rustle of dry leaves. She nodded. "I remember the sound of your voice more than anything." It was the first thing that felt real again. Everett turned to her, his face lined from weather and years, but his eyes the same as they had been that day, steady, deliberate. "You were always real. You just needed the world to catch up." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched the wind tug at the last leaves clinging to the maples by the fence line and thought about how far she had traveled without leaving the valley. The hatch, the dock, the 37 knots, those things lived in her memory, still, but they no longer defined its borders. She squeezed his hand, once a small anchor in the cool morning. "It did catch up," she said finally. "And it looks like this." He smiled, not the quick, sharp kind, but the slow one that started in his eyes and made its way outward like the sun climbing into the day. For a while they didn't speak, just listened to the sounds of their land, waking the distant cluck of hens. The faint creak of the barn door in the breeze, the soft sigh of the wind through the pines. It was the same world it had been when they started, and yet entirely remade. Always forward, always together. The light stretched long over the land that morning, laying gold across the grass and shadow across the porch. They sat in that balance, neither hurrying nor holding it back. There had been years of hunger and years of plenty, winters that pressed hard summers that gave freely, and through all of it they had moved in step, not perfectly, but faithfully. The fears that had once driven Kiara to glance over her shoulder were now only echoes, and when they rose, she met them not with flight, but with the feel of Everett's hand closing around hers. They spoke sometimes about what would come next. There were repairs to make before winter seeds to order for spring. The schoolhouse roof would need new shingles in a year or two. Life kept offering its small demands, and they kept meeting them side by side. Neither looked far beyond that, not because they feared the future, but because they knew its shape would be made from the choices of each day. That afternoon, Everett walked the fence while Kiara cleaned the school's slate boards, the two of them working in separate spheres of the same world. When the sun dropped low and the air cooled, they found each other again on the porch. No one else might have seen it, but there was a quiet thread between them, taut and unbroken, as present as the boards under their feet. They had survived what should have ended them. They had built what could hold them, and they carried it forward with the same steady, unspoken vow that had begun in a rescue and grown into a life. Always forward, always together. The shape of the life. They made the years had left their signature on both of them lines where the sun had etched its warmth into skin. The easy strength in Everett's hands, from a lifetime of building and mending, the quiet steadiness in Kiara's gaze that came from surviving herself back into the world. The cabin stood as proof of those same years, weathered boards silvered by time, a porch that creaked in familiar places, the second room and wide overhang that hadn't been there in the beginning. The land around them bore their work in every season, fence lines that held soil that yielded in its turn, and the garden that had once been a single stubborn plot now sprawling in orderly rows. On a late summer evening, the sky held the soft blue of a worn quilt, and the wind slid gently down from the ridge, carrying the smell of pine warmed through the day. Everett sat in his chair on the porch, boots planted solidly, Kiara's hand resting in his. He could feel the faint, steady pulse under her fingers, the same as he had all those years ago when he'd lifted her from the dark. The hatch was long gone, the cellar filled in, but the memory had been folded into the fabric of their life, less a wound now than a seam. You ever think about what it might have been like if I'd just kept riding that day? He asked, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the question carried the weight of what had been spared. She didn't look away from the horizon when she said, "Then I would have kept counting knots until I couldn't count anymore." Her voice was calm, the words without bitterness. Then she turned to him. "But you didn't keep riding?" "No," he said. "I didn't." He watched her smile, then slow and full, the kind that belonged to no one else but him. The porch boards creaked as she shifted closer, their shoulders touching. Out in the pasture, the last of the day's light brushed along the grass tips like a benediction. They didn't speak after that. There was no need. The shape of their life was all around them, in the worn grain of the porch rail where Kiara rested her arm, in the steady hum of crickets, in the stretch of land that had carried their footsteps side by side for decades. Everett glanced once toward the garden, now heavy with late beans and squash, and thought about the first time she'd said she wanted to plant something and see it grow. He tightened his hand over hers, and she answered with a small press of her own, not a squeeze, not even a signal, just the quiet reminder that they were still here. Still choosing, still carrying forward what they had made together. The light deepened the air, cooling as the sun slipped behind the ridge. Somewhere a night bird called, and the pines answered in their slow, ancient whisper. Two silhouettes sat on the porch, one life between them measured not by years, but by the unbroken thread that ran from the first moment to the last. Always forward, always together.